Hey everybody, this is Kendall from the Recording Lounge podcast again, doing another video where we figure out some answers and see what's going on in the world of audio. So I get a lot of questions about cutting versus boosting EQ. Now I have my own opinions on this, and I'll admit there's a lot of opinion involved in this, but I want to try to show you some things that aren't opinion, that are factual, that I can prove to you, that cutting and boosting, you shouldn't be afraid of either one. However, you might have an opinion on which one sounds better, and I'll give you a couple reasons why. But the first thing I wanted to dispel is the idea that boosting causes more problems with phase than cutting. That's a total myth, all right? That's not the argument I'm talking about here. I'm going to prove that to you. So right here, I've got a low shelf and a high shelf. This one's cutting, this one's boosting. They both are at 600 hertz. They both are 3.5 dB of change, and they both have a Q of 1.5. So this program here is VST Plugin Analyzer, and this is showing our phase shift, okay, plus up to 180 degrees plus or minus. So I'm going to show you that the phase relationship between boosting the lows versus cutting the highs, given the same EQ move, is the same. So check this out. Notice this phase shape, sort of this phase shift here. Just kind of burn this in your mind real quick. It's centered around 600 hertz. It's about plus 20 degrees. It goes all the way down from basically 0 all the way up to 20K. Now when I take this off and add this, look at that. It's the exact same phase shift, okay? Now again, this is given the exact same EQ move, cutting versus boosting, but that allows us to rule out that cutting inherently or boosting inherently is better or worse in terms of phase. They are identical. Okay, however, this is not always the case. You know, we're not necessarily doing things like this. It might come in the form of, say, a high-pass filter versus a shelf. Okay, so in this instance, we've got a high-pass filter. Notice how much of a phase shift there is with high-pass filters. Okay, some have argued that, if you're trying to cut out, say, boominess on a vocal or on an acoustic guitar, that it's actually much more natural sounding to use a shelf. And I can see that argument. You can see there's a huge phase shift when you do a high-pass filter versus a shelf has much less phase shift. Now, again, I'm not saying that's better or worse. Who really cares? If it sounds good, it sounds good, right? But check this out. Again, we can't necessarily say that shelves inherently have less phase shift than high-pass filters. It's more about sort of the shape and the frequencies that you're actually cutting out. Check this out. I've got this high-pass back up now. Notice this sort of shape. Now, I've done a shelf with a very similar, I couldn't get it exactly, but a very similar shape. You can see here, I've tried to match the shelf pretty closely to the high-pass filter in terms of its shape. So we can see the high-pass and the shelf. Okay, it's not quite affecting the phase as much, but pretty close. It's doing this big, wide shift here. So again, you can't necessarily say that shelves are inherently, cause fewer phase problems than high-pass filters necessarily. But I think the sort of spirit of that sentiment is more tied in, hey, you don't have to go all the way down to 0 like this or negative infinity. You can just pull down some low end like this. If you need to cut a little bit of low end on something, you can just pull it down. You don't have to do this huge, wide, because if you look at this, you're only really, I'm going to go back to my 12 dB view, you're really only cutting about 3 dB at 100 hertz here, versus you could just use a shelf and cut about the same amount, 3 dB at 100 hertz, and you get much less phase shift, that versus that. If, again, that sounds better to you. Again, I'm not saying you need to worry about phase shift. I'm just saying decide for yourself if you think that these phase shifts don't sound as good, if they're high like this. If you like the sound of a high-pass filter, use it. Okay, the next example I wanted to give you is, excuse me, 2 shelves versus 1 cut. Now, some people have said it's better to, make 2 smaller moves than 1 wider move, and I think that's a complete myth. I think do whatever you want, whatever sounds good. So check this out. These aren't identical. I tried to match them as close as possible. Maybe something like this. It's really hard to get them identical, but check this out. So we've got a boost in the lows, a boost in the highs. Again, this is 6 dB, and I'm going to try to match this as close as I can. But notice what happens. So notice this sort of phase shift here. We've got up to plus 20, then down to minus 20, and then back up. If I take these bands off and add our mid-range cut, look at that. It's pretty much the same. Not identical, but again, that's mostly because of I can't get the Q exactly the same. But it's pretty much the exact same type of phase shift, right? So that's a myth too. That boosting twice, two smaller things is better than cutting one big wide thing. That's a complete myth, okay? It's the same. Now, I will give you some arguments as to why a lot of people think that cutting sounds better. Okay, there are two main ones that I wanted to say. The first one is headroom. Okay, so notice here, with this plugin analyzer, it runs a signal into the plugin all the way up, hitting at 0. So this can be aligned at 0, right? So if I am saying, okay, let's say this acoustic guitar is a little bit boomy, and naturally I'm the type of person that, okay, I'm going to boost some high end. Well, now we're actually clipping the plugin. Now, if you record at a decent level and you keep good headroom practices in your mix, this shouldn't be a problem. You should be able to boost and cut freely without worrying about that. But when in doubt, cutting, the nice thing about cutting is that you're actually reducing your headroom. So now, when we cut low end, we're actually not pushing as hard as we were before. Again, the phase shift is going to be basically the same whether you're cutting or boosting, give or take, but you're actually reducing output level, making sure you're not clipping any plugins. And so when in doubt, cutting conserves your headroom. So that's a good argument. The other reason that I think some people think that cutting sounds better than boosting is, let's say we're working with an analog EQ that has sort of like fixed bells that you can't quite adjust. So let's say we're cutting 200 hertz here. EQ has sort of a reflexive quality to it where some people, when they hear something that sounds muddy, they want to cut. Whereas other people, when they hear something that sounds muddy, they want to boost a high frequency. So let's say, again, you've got a vocal and it sounds a little bit muddy. Some people might boost some high end to give it a little bit more clarity. And other people might cut some low mids or whatever. Okay, and that's because EQ to our ear has this sort of reflexive relationship. But notice the differences then. When we cut here, we get this sort of move versus boosting here. I'm going to get rid of this one now. We get this sort of move. So it is basically the same type of move, but some would argue that this is actually a more subtle, it's actually better and less noticeable doing phase shifts in the lows and mids as opposed to in the highs. And I kind of get that. I get that our ears are more sensitive to high frequencies and upper mid frequencies, and so perhaps we can detect phase shifts better up in this region. Again, there's not a whole lot of scientific proof behind that, but it does make sense. So I do get the idea that some people say, well, if you're going to cause a phase shift, cause it in the low mids, not in the high mids. And I understand that. To me, scientifically, it makes a little more sense actually the opposite way in some ways, that we'd actually notice more of a phase shift in the lows. But I won't get into that. That's another argument. Again, that part's opinion, and that's up to you to decide. If you think, if you need to brighten up something that's muddy versus cut some mud out of something, that's up for you to decide which one you think sounds better. But in general, my rule of thumb is, when in doubt, if you are listening to something and you don't like a quality about it, like acoustic guitar, that means you need to cut it out. Okay, so if you're listening to your acoustic or your electric or your piano or your vocal and it sounds muddy to you, don't boost something, cut something. But if you're listening to something and you want more, like you want a little bit more aggression out of that electric guitar, then boost there. Boost, if you want your electric guitar to be a little more aggressive, you can boost in the high mids between 1 and 5K, depending on whatever works. And that's just an example. But that's my tip for you is add more of what you like, but if you don't like something, cut it. To me, that sort of general rule of thumb has served me well. And I also, I understand that every EQ is different. Every EQ has different shapes and every EQ, like Neve EQs versus API EQs, which versus the FabFilter, which you can adjust heavily what, curves and shapes you have for all these, and you can adjust, your slope and all this stuff. So I get that. So the moral of the story, cut what you don't like, boost what you do like, try out different EQs. Don't just, use one EQ. Try out different EQs because they all have different shapes. An analog EQ might have a shape that FabFilter, might need 2 or 3 bands to create. A lot of some older analog EQs have this sort of undershoot here or overshoot, and FabFilter, you actually need 2 bands to create this. So anyway, guys, I hope this video has been interesting. I hope it's taught you a thing or two. As always, check out recordingloungepodcast.com. Check out the podcast on iTunes and coming soon to the Google Play Store. Send me an email at recordingloungepodcast@gmail.com if you have questions or video suggestions. Thanks.